Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the semifinals of the Chess Champions Tour being held here in Toronto, Canada. Now, my run unfortunately ended yesterday when I was eliminated in 5th place, but today we have the final 4 who are competing. We have Norbert Abusatorov against Wesley So, and we have Fabiano Caruana facing off against the former 5-time world chess champion Magnus Carlsen. Now, in the interest of the fact that this is a YouTube video and I cannot cover every game in full detail without the video running super long, we're going to keep it pretty brief. So, the format is a little bit different than it was for the first part of the event. In this situation, the players play matches of 4 games, or essentially what you could call a tennis set. What that means is if the 4 games are tied 2-2, you play an Armageddon game, and you're playing a best of 2. So essentially, if Magnus were to win today, Fabiano has to win tomorrow. If he wins the match tomorrow and it's 1-1, there will be a third match of 2 games, potentially followed by an Armageddon. So 4 games of rapid chess, followed by Armageddon potentially today, and let's jump into the action. So, the first game that we're going to be taking a look at is the 4th game of the match. Yes, you guys heard that correctly. We're looking at the 4th game. So I'll give you a brief summary before we get right into it. In the first game, Magnus Carlsen had a very small advantage out of the opening in a classic Spanish, the Archangel variation, something which Fabiano Caruana recently did a course on called the Dark Archangel on the chess website Chessable. So, very wild game, went back and forth towards the end when players got down to seconds on the clock. Fabiano actually obtained a winning position with the black pieces, but at the very end, he made the final blunder and Magnus Carlsen won. However, in games 2 and 3, Fabiano came back very strong. In the second game, he won a nice game with the white pieces in the Sicilian Rossolimo, and in the third game, he showed his mettle by winning in the Archangel, once again in the Spanish. So, we're going to game number 4. Fabiano leading by a score of 2-1. Magnus Carlsen playing with the black pieces, and he must win this game. So let's dive into the action. So the game starts with the move d4. We get knight to f6, c4 played by Fabiano, and now Magnus plays this move b6. Now, one of the tricks is when you're in a must-win situation with the black pieces, generally you try to play something that's a little bit less solid, and you're hoping that your opponent perhaps is surprised. So in my case, when I was in a must-win against Wesley So very early on in the tournament, I played the classic Ben Oni with c5, but in this case, Magnus plays b6. So we get b6, Fabiano plays knight c3. Now, one fun fact here is those of you guys who have watched some of my recent streams, I actually played this move b6 against this player who has the username of Jim Degrees on chess.com. It's a very talented Russian junior player, and I actually was getting punished brutally in many of the games where after f3, knight c6, he would play knight c3, e5, d5, knight e7, and then after g4, the computer already gives white a very big advantage here, and it's very hard to play. So, I was a little bit surprised to see Magnus play b6, considering that I had played it online recently. It is one of those sidelines that can be played. Nonetheless, you got to do something, so it's not too surprising that Magnus chose this. So we get knight c3, bishop b7 played by Magnus, and here Fabiano plays f3. Now, this is still completely reasonable, but one of the drawbacks here is that you've already developed the knight, whereas if we go back to this position and f3 is played, if black goes d5 here after takes, and e4, you have to move the knight away, and you cannot trade the knights on c3 potentially, and after knight f6, knight c3, white gets this nice center, and white has a big advantage here. So, instead, we get the position here, bishop b7, f3, d5 played by Magnus, pawn takes, and here Fabiano plays a strange move, knight takes knight. Now, I think for Fabiano, he probably thought, why not trade off a set of knights, less pieces on the board, and after takes e4, I'll be able to bring the knight in, develop the bishops, castle the king, great harmony, and I'll have a big advantage. On the other hand, however, in this position, e4 would have been better because after takes, white gets this nice center with the 4 pawns here. You can always develop, let's say, bishop e3, something like bishop d3, castles, and knight e2. And the pawns combined with the 2 b's in the center of the board give white a very nice center. Instead, Fabiano trades here, but after takes e4, queen d7, Fabiano starts going wrong with this move, bishop c4. Now, this is only move number 8 of the game, but the players are clearly out of their preparation, and Fabiano makes this mistake. I think that Fabiano initially thought he could play knight e2 and something like knight c3, bishop e3, something like queen d2 and rook d1 with bishop e2 and castles, just to illustrate it, something like this, bishop e2, and then something like castles. And white again has a nice center, the 2 bishops protecting, and white has a nice advantage. But Fabiano probably started seeing some ghosts here. Maybe he thought that after knight to e2 in this position, maybe there's something like e5 here, and after white plays like d takes e5, maybe something like queen d1 and knight c6 followed by castles. A lot of pressure on the center of the board potentially. You're not really sure what's going on, and so I think Fabiano initially was just going to play knight e2 when he traded on d5, but then in this position he started to think, started becoming a little bit unsure of himself, and he changed his plan by going bishop c4. Very similar idea, by the way, if white is not impeded, which is to play knight e2 here, guarding the pawn on d4, something like bishop 2 e3, and after castles, knight c6, and queen d2. White, again, has this nice center with the knight, the bishop, and the queen guarding the pawn, and the bishop on c4 is on a very nice diagonal as well. So if you can get all of these moves in, white will have a nice advantage. So for Magnus here, he realizes that there are some issues, and he has to react very quickly. So Magnus plays knight c6 here, attacking the pawn on d4 with the knight and the queen. We get bishop e3 played by Fabiano to guard the pawn, and now Magnus castles the king. Now for Magnus, this is a dream because first of all, Magnus must win this game. If he does not win this game, he will lose his first match of the semifinals. And so for Magnus, there's really no difference between winning this game and losing this game. He has one result that matters, so he can be a little bit less objective and play for counterplay. The funny thing is, the computer already thinks that black is better in this position. And we are only on move number 9. So Fabiano plays knight to e2, guarding the pawn on d4 with the knight, the bishop, and the queen. We now get this move e5 played by Magnus, trying to strike at this white center right away here, develop with bishop b4, maybe knight a5 to hit the bishop, and it just looks very, very chaotic here for white to deal with all this pressure. Fabiano here plays bishop b5, trying to relieve some of the pressure by trading the bishop for the knight potentially, while also pinning this knight on c6. So we get e takes d4. Fabiano captures with the knight, and now Magnus plays this nice move, queen e7. Black would love to take the horse on d4, but then you do a Botez gambit, lose your queen and the game as well. So we get queen to e7 played here by Magnus, sidestepping the pin on the diagonal, but now creating his own pin on the d-file towards the knight on d4 and the queen on d1. So after queen to e7, we get this move bishop takes c6 played by Fabiano. Bishop takes c6, and now Fabiano blunders with this move, castles. And already here, we're only on move number 14, but the computer gives black an advantage of more than 2 at this point, and we've only played 14 moves. Computer actually wants white to play queen b3 here, sidestepping the threats of the pin on the d-file. Also, if black goes queen b4, you can trade the queens and simply play an endgame here. And after, say, rook d1 and rook c1, black might have a small advantage due to having the 2 b's, but in general, white should be able to defend and draw the game. Instead, Fabiano castles here, and now after queen to f6 is played, white has a serious problem with this knight on d4, the pin on the d-file, and additionally, to make matters worse, there are problems for the king and the bishop on this long dark square diagonal to boot. So, after queen to f6, we get rook f2 played by Fabiano. Magnus goes bishop c5, overloading the pressure on the knight on d4 and the queen on d1. We get rook d2, trying to break the pin. And now we get the move rook to d7 being played by Magnus. And this is a huge mistake. What Magnus should have played was this move rook to d6. And the reason he should have played rook to d6 here is that now if white plays this move king h1, you can go rook hd8. You've got the double stack. All kinds of pressure here. Pressure on the long diagonal from the queen as well. And black is simply winning here. But instead, Magnus plays rook d7, and now Fabiano blunders with this move, knight c2. What Fabiano should have played here was king to h1, because now if black plays this move rook hd8, it looks like the same thing, but there's one very important difference, which is that if white plays e5 here, attacking the queen, when you take this pawn, white takes this bishop, attacking the queen. You take the bishop with your queen, but white can check you with knight takes pawn. King moves, swap all the rooks off the board. The rook on a1 covers the back rank squares, so there's no classic ice skater here, and white is simply winning. Whereas with the rook on d6, just to illustrate it again, if you get this position with e5 after takes queen e3 here, if white were to take the rook, you take back, and the rook is guarded, and if you go knight a7, king b7, now there's no rook that's hanging on the d7 square, because the rook is protected on d6. So, here we get this move, rook d7, knight c2 being played by Fabiano. A big mistake here. Now, of course, after bishop to d6 is played, black has a big advantage. Bishop d6 might not be the best move, by the way, but when you do go bishop d6 here, the idea is simple. Magnus wants to stack the towers, put pressure on all the diagonals of the queen and the bishop, and when you combine that with having the 2 b's here, white's position is very difficult to play, especially because Fabiano here is already down to 2 minutes on the clock. So we get rook c1. Magnus stacks the 2 rooks on the d file, and now we get this move queen to e1, which is not the best move, but already here it's very hard to play. Black has a lot of threats. b2 pawn is hanging. The bishop a2, bishop takes h2 ideas in the air. Queen h4 also an idea, and so Fabi goes queen e1 to stop queen h4. But now there's a tactical solution, which is Magnus sacks the bishop temporarily. You get king takes bishop, rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, queen d6, checking the king, but also hitting the bishop on d2 at the same time, as well as creating the classic right triangle. So Fabiano goes king g1, queen takes bishop is played, we get knight to e3, and now Magnus trades and goes rook d2. Now Magnus is only up 1 pawn here. He has 6 pawns versus 5 pawns on the board. But when you combine the passive rook position on e1 here and the king not being in the center of the board yet, black should be technically winning. So we get rook c1, bishop d7, knight c4 is played. We have rook d4, b3, bishop to e6, trying to remove the knight from the center. Also, you'll note that all the white pawns are on the same color as this menacing light square dark bishop. So we get knight to a3, a6 played here by Magnus. Now, Magnus could have played rook to d2 here, but I suspect that he didn't want to play this endgame with the bishop versus the knight, even though he has 1 extra pawn, because Fabiano is so low on time here that you don't want Fabiano to be able to play 20 quick moves and gain time on the clock, where he will have obvious ideas. So we get a6 being played, knight b1, a5, king f2, and now we have a4 being played here. Magnus trying to undermine the pawn chain on the queen side. We get king to e3, c5 played here to protect the rook on d4. Knight d2 is played, king b7, we get rook h1, h6, f4, and now Magnus plays f6. We get rook c1, takes, and rook b4. So Magnus remains up a pawn here, but most importantly, there's a lot of pressure towards the pawn on e4 as well as the pawn on b3. So Fabiano goes rook c3 to guard the pawn. We get king c6 played here. Apparently, computer wants f5 right away, but it's good enough. So we have king c6, rook d3, f5 played here by Magnus at long last, and now Fabiano trades the pawns. White could play e5, but after bishop to d5, black gets the classic wooden shield here with the bishop in the center of the board. Also down the road, there are ideas like g5, and let's just say you keep waiting. Now black can start pushing this h pawn up the board, and eventually white will have to give up the pawn on b3 or allow this pawn to queen. So Fabiano trades on f5 here. We get this move bishop takes f5 being played, and after bishop takes f5, rook d8 is played. We get bishop e6, rook d3, a bunch of waiting moves here played by Magnus, just back and forth here. And finally, in this position, he's able to get here where after h5, white is in what we call the classic Zugzwang position. I apologize for any German viewers who hear me butcher these words and mispronounce them, but this is what we call Zugzwang, where basically if you're playing this position with the white piece, you don't want to make a move. You want it to be black's turn. But unfortunately, white has to move. So whoever has to move doesn't want to move, and that's why we call this term Zugzwang. Because in this position, Fabiano has to move the king or the rook. If you move the knight, I just take here, and now I've got 2 connected pawns rolling up the board. If you move the rook, I just take this one. So you can't really move the rook or the knight without losing this pawn on b3, and you can't push any pawns on the king side either. They both get captured, and so Fabiano moves the king. But now when you move the king, I can play h4 to undermine the pawn chain of 2, whereas here, let's just say we get this position. I'll just set it up. Something like this, for example, where it's black's move. Black doesn't have a move that he can do either. He wants to keep the rook and the bishop spying the pawn, but he can't push either h4 or g5 because white's king guards the pawn on f4. So unfortunately for Fabiano at Zugzwang, he has to go king f2. We get h4, takes, rook f4, king g3, rook d4, and now Magnus targets the knight. The pawn on h4 is weak, and there's rook d3 to create the kebab on the 3rd rank as well. So Fabiano goes rook a2. We get king to b4. We have knight f1. Bishop takes pawn, rook a6 is played, but now Magnus quietly and coolly goes rook d6, guarding both the pawns on the 6th, and he has a simple idea of starting to push p up the c file and win the game. So we get knight e3, c4, king f4, c3, king e5, and now Magnus plays rook c6 here, and Fabiano Caruana has to resign this heartbreaking 4th game where he was leading 2-1, had the white pieces, and it just did not go the way he wanted. So Fabiano loses in this 4th game, which means that now the match is tied 2-2, and we go to the dreaded, or really exciting, depending on your point of view, Armageddon game. So going into Armageddon game, I was actually doing live coverage on my Kick channel, and my guess was that based on the flow of the games, Magnus would probably make a pretty low bid because in both of his white games, he did not get anything whatsoever in the classic Dark Archangel against Fabiano. He won the 1st game, which he shouldn't have. He lost the 3rd game where he got outplayed, and so I knew that Magnus would go low. But how low can you go? So Magnus ended up bidding 8 minutes and 56 seconds. I think Fabiano bid 10 minutes and 35 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. Magnus wins the bid. He chooses the black pieces. And in this game, Magnus Carlsen playing with the black pieces must not lose. If Magnus loses to Fabiano, he will lose the first mini match or the first set, and he will be in a deep hole. So Fabiano starts with e4. We get c5 being played here. We get this move, knight to f3, and now we have e6 being played. Now, this is the first fairly serious surprise here, because Magnus decides to play the Sicilian, or more specifically, the classic Wrath of Khan variation with e6 and a6, rather than choosing to play something more solid, like, say, e4, e5. So we get the classic Khan variation here after a6, knight c3, queen c7, bishop d3, knight f6, all very standard so far, queen e2, d6 to stop e5 here. And now we have f4 being played by Fabiano. After f4, we get knight bd7. And here, Fabiano goes all in on the king side. He starts pushing his pawns up the king side, wants to harass the black knights and take as much space as possible. So Magnus plays knight c5. We get g5, knight fd7. That's the whole point of moving this knight so that the other one can scoop back. And now the knight on c5 intends to either trade for the bishop on d3 or to put pressure on the pawn on e4. Here, Fabiano goes a4, a very logical move, because one of the main ideas, whether it's a Najdorf, a Scheveningen, or other classic Sicilians, is that black wants to go a6 and b5, and down the road you have bishop b7 to scope on the diagonal. You also have b4 to undermine the knight, and there's a lot of pressure in the center of the board. So when Fabiano goes a4, he stops the b5 pawn push. So now Magnus plays bishop e7, we get h4, and now the move b6 played here with the idea of fianchettoing the bishop to b7. However, with the pawn on a4 and b6 here, the idea of undermining the protection, very specifically the knight on c3, is very difficult to achieve because you can't play b5. So we get bishop e3, bishop b7, Fabiano plays h5, and now Magnus plays this move, rook c8. Now, I really do like this position for white, but one of the things I would say that I don't like about it is that Fabiano has pushed all these pawns up the board on the king side, and if you don't have a straightforward plan right away, the game is going to explode in a situation where black has enough time on the clock to use a minute, and it'll lead to a concrete solution. So we get rook g1 for Fabiano, and now Magnus plays g6 here. It's still very good for white. We have rook h1, and Magnus goes e5. Now, up to this point, Fabiano has been moving very, very quickly, but here I feel like he starts to not take his time as much as he really needed to. He plays h takes g6, we get take, and now he plays this move knight f3 after a 6-second think. Now, for all the Armageddon games that I played, including my recap of against MVL and Noterbeck, it's very, very difficult to understand what are the moments to use time and when not to use time. Honestly, I don't think it's something you can learn. I think all it comes down to is just that intuitive sense of what those moments are. And Fabiano misses that opportunity when he plays knight f3 very quickly here. Now, what Fabiano should have played is he should have thrown all caution to the wind and sacrificed with the move pawn to f5 here to really pressure the pawn on g6. Now, you're like, wait, free horse. And it is a free horse, but after takes knight e5 and f takes g6, black cannot recapture the knight because then you lose the rook in the corner. Mind you, this is still, the show goes on, but white should be winning. Take with the pawn, you lose the rook. So you can't really take the pawn on g6 here, which means white can go g7, rook h7, gh7, and your king on e8 can't even castle to the queen side because you moved the rook to c8. And the game is a whole mess here. It's not really clear what's going on, but I do think Fabiano would have had great chances to win this game. So instead, Fabiano plays knight f3, but now Magnus can trade on f4 and trade on d3 and go knight to e5. And just like that, Magnus has clarified the situation in 3 moves, and now his king is not going to be attacked anymore. He can always castle the king side. White's king actually now is a serious liability, because if you castle queen side, there's already an open c file here. If you castle king side, for example, you've already pushed piece, so you have no pawns in front of your king. So for example, say you got something like this as an illustration. Something like, let me just set it up. Something like this, for example. Wait, I played queen d7. Oh, white can't castle here? Oh, white moved the rook. Never mind. I'm actually stupid. White already moved the rook, so white can't castle here. But even if white could somehow manually set this up here with the king on g1, there are always ideas like queen h3 or queen g4 here, and black is actually winning. That's gonna be really funny when people comment on the video here. So white actually can't castle kingside because he played rook g1, rook h1. But even if he could, it'd be very bad. So Fabiano plays bishop e3. We get castles here from Magnus, putting pressure on the f file. And here Fabiano goes knight d4. Now white could trade the knights, but the problem is that now you open up the scope for this dark square bishop, and your king can't go this way. It really can't go this way either, because of bishop b4, even b5, b4. And Fabiano is in real trouble here with this very weak king in the center. So we get knight d4 here. Magnus goes queen d7. Important moves. If you do allow knight e6, that would fork the queen and the rook. So we get queen d7 to stop knight e6. We have castles played by Fabiano. Now, this is a move that I think he played out of desperation. He's still at 4 minutes on the clock, but the problem is that Fabiano uses a lot of time at this point when he's already much worse. Magnus will just simply use that time, start thinking on his turn, and probably come up with easy solutions. So we get castles. Magnus goes b5 here with the idea of b4 to undermine the horse. We get a takes b5, a takes b5, and now king b1 is played here by Fabiano. After king b1, we get b4, knight to a2 is played, and now this great move d5 is a move, a very thematic pawn push by Magnus, because now he opens up the scope for both of the two b's here, and white's position is pretty much hopeless at this point. That being said, it's an Armageddon game where anything goes, and Fabiano finds a great practical chance by sacking the rook with rook takes h7. After king takes rook, we get queen h2, checking the king, hitting the knight. King g8 is played, and now rook h1 with the idea of checkmating on h7 with the classic double stack. After rook to h1, Magnus plays bishop d6 to guard the knight, but also the queen covers the checkmate square on h7. Now we get to move bishop to f4, and here Magnus finds an excellent move, which is actually, sorry, queen g7 is not the excellent move, but it's fine. It's the next move that will be the excellent move. But he plays queen g7 here, seeing that after knight to e6, there's this brilliant move, knight to f3, which essentially forces a draw here. Now, you're probably thinking, well, why is computer saying queen g7 double question mark? That's because after d takes e4, black is winning here. But this move in an Armageddon game is borderline insane to consider. There's queen h8 check with like rook h7. The king runs and black's fine. But there's also something like takes, and queen e5. You worry about the mate on h8 suddenly, and it's really, really difficult. Now, in typical computer fashion, it says that after take, you can very quietly just take the pawn on d3, ignore everything on the h-file, run your king to e8, and you're winning the game. But in a human situation here with limited time on the clock, no human would ever play this move, especially not with 3 minutes. Maybe if you have 30 minutes on the clock, you could play it in a situation where you need to win, but not with, say, 4 minutes. Which is why this queen g7 move is so brilliant after a 30-second thing. Because if this were me playing with black, earlier in the turn, there's a very good chance here I might just panic and make a huge blunder. But Magnus uses 30 seconds, and he comes up with the right idea, which is after queen g7, knight to e6, we have this nice move, knight to f3, counter-attacking the white queen while white is attacking your own black queen. So after knight to f3, we get this move, knight takes queen, which is a mistake from Fabiano, effectively losing the game. However, if Fabiano were to move the queen to, say, h3, for example, after rook takes f4, black sacks the queen, but you have a repetition with knight d2 check. The rook covers these critical squares on the c file. And after king a1 check, there's simply nothing better for white to do than make the repetition. And of course, a draw is good enough for Magnus to win the match. Additionally, in this position here, if you were to say move the queen to g2, it's the same thing, but in a different direction, where I can take with the bishop, you take my queen, and now the bishop guards the knight, and with the same thing where I just keep yo-yoing with the knight back and forth, make the repetition, draw the game, and win the match. So Fabiano, after think, plays knight takes queen, but now after knight takes queen, bishop takes bishop, rook to f1 check played by Magnus, trade. Fabiano simply hangs the knight on g7 when he takes the pawn on b4. He could have played knight e6. It remains to be seen whether Magnus would have forced a draw, where he could have again made the same repetition with the horsey, or whether he would have played for more with d takes e4 and tried to win. Regardless, it would not have changed the outcome. Fabiano instead takes the pawn, stopping knight d2, but now he loses the knight on g7, and when all the dust is settled, black has a bishop, a knight, and a rook. White simply has a bishop and a knight, so black is up a rook and should win the game very cleanly. The game concludes after bishop c3, king f7, we get knight b4, takes, bishop takes, king a2, knight to e3, and here Fabiano resigns the game. He's down a rook. Magnus's next move will be knight to d5, trading off the knight for a bishop or a knight, and with the extra rook, there's no doubt that Magnus would win the game. So a very, very exciting match today. Very difficult result for Fabiano, certainly, because even though I didn't show you the first 3 games, he had legitimate chances to win all 3 of the first games. He had better position in game 1. Actually, he was winning in game 1, the crazy game that he lost. He won games 2 and 3, lost that heartbreaker in game 4, which we just looked at, and then he loses the Armageddon. And I think these sorts of days really epitomize why Magnus is so difficult to play against and why he is considered to be the best player by a big margin. Because even on a day like today, when Magnus was nowhere near his best, he still finds a way to beat the second best player in the world, Fabiano Caruana. And when that happens, you're just like, what can you do? If he's at his best, you know you have no chance. If he's not at his best, he's still probably better than anybody else, and it makes for a very frustrating time. And frankly, as a competitor, a difficult situation to deal with. So Magnus wins his first match. Tomorrow, he and Fabiano will be back at it. They'll play another match. Fabiano will have to win the match tomorrow, or he will be, I believe, eliminated in 3rd/4th place. But there still is another match, and considering the good positions Fabiano had, you never know what he'll have up his sleeve for tomorrow. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. Make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already. And I'll be back tomorrow with another great banger of a recap after the second match between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. See you guys. Bye.